Even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them. They can be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason, above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son.
Welcome back to another episode of Smallville Meets Krypton. If you're just joining us for the first time, I highly recommend you go back and watch the first couple of episodes. It'll give you a little bit more context as to what's happening and where we are in this crazy story. But for the rest of you, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the show. So when we left off last time, I had just pulled up to my mom's house and was visiting with my sister just briefly. As I said before, she didn't have really much to share with me that she knew. She did know one thing, which was that she had an understanding, or she was aware, that my birth mom still lived in Tooele, or the Tooele area, when I was born, or at least stuck around there. Obviously, I mean, I was born in Tooele, so she stuck around there, and that knowledge kind of haunted my adopted mom quite a bit. And so that was about the only thing that she could share, other than, as she said before, that she always treated me as if I was her brother and never thought of me any differently, which, again, I'm grateful for. So I go into the house and I sit down and I start explaining to my mom that I got my DNA results. And in looking through my DNA results, I discovered that nothing seemed to add up. I explained how, from the results of people that I was connected to from a DNA standpoint, there wasn't any one of our relatives. And then I started explaining how, in the lineage or the geography standpoint, where you're from, mine showed English and Scottish and a little bit of German. But my understanding was that my family was all Swedish and Polish. And so when I explained this to my mom, she quickly tried to a little bit of dance around it and explain how, well, our family's also from England. But I think she was kind of missing the point that I know what's happened, and I know what the truth is. So I go through that process. My dad then shows up, and I begin the process again, explaining the fact that I got my results. And then I continue to explain to them that Luke came over the night before. He told me everything. The cat's out of the bag. I know that I'm adopted. So what happened? As they went into explaining it to me, the first thing that my mom kept saying is that she wanted to protect me from the thought that if I knew that I was adopted, that somehow I would immediately jump to the idea that my birth mother didn't want me. Now, as a 36-year-old, I absolutely didn't believe that, because I know as a parent that I would never give up a child and think, I don't want this child. But maybe as a 18-year-old, maybe as a 10-year-old, maybe I wouldn't connect those dots, and I might feel a little bit nervous or feel hurt, like my birth mother, or as in the adopted community we like to call our first mother, didn't love me. But I didn't feel that. I didn't feel for 1 second that my first mother didn't love me. In fact, my drive to connect with her and tell her that I was okay was so strong that nothing anybody said was going to change my mind. Nothing was going to detract me from that, because I knew I needed to get to her, and I needed her to know that I'm okay, and that I'm grateful for the life she's given me. I continued to explain to them how Maggie and I have had challenges, and we thought about adoption ourselves. So this whole knowledge has completely had completely shaken us. Granted, we had Calvin by now, so it wasn't as relevant. But I need to take a step back here. I need you to understand that for the first 10 years of our marriage, and I'm going to let Maggie explain this even better than I can, but I do want to explain something, is that for the first 10 years of our marriage, Maggie and I desperately wanted to have children. And we went through a number of different attempts, procedures, doctor visits. I remember the first doctor visit where one of her doctors said, "You probably just need to exercise more." And I thought, it's time to get a new doctor, Maggie. But regardless, we went through so many different things, so many emotions, so many challenges, and we thought about adoption. We looked at adoption. We looked at the process for adoption, and we thought that maybe that would be a direction for us. But there was a tremendous fear we had that eventually, when our child grew up, that they would no longer love us and that they wouldn't care for us anymore. So now here I am, a 36-year-old. Well, today I'm 38, but a 36-year-old discovering that I'm adopted and experiencing some of those exact fears that Maggie and I carried. And I remember, and I still feel this way, that I absolutely do not want to be and don't believe that I am the poster child for adoption. I know that there are wonderful stories about adoption, about the success that those families have, about people who could care less about their birth family. But my family has a little bit more of a complex background, a little bit more of a complex history. And as I've said before, I have never felt really connected to my adopted family, and I didn't know why. I didn't understand what was causing that. And there were some disconnects because my parents got divorced when I was very young, and the reasons for that divorce and the turmoil that divorce creates in any family, let alone one where there's a child that's been adopted, it just adds a lot of complexity to the situation. And so I share this because as I explained to my adopted parents that Maggie and I had thought about adoption, but we didn't go through that process. It's our yearning for a child was so great that now that we had a child, I felt so deeply connected to him. And I'll touch on that again in a minute. But anyway, so I explained to them our process. And then for Maggie and I, for that 10 years when we were trying to have children and unable to have children, we were very, very fortunate to have some wonderful kids in our lives. Some kids who we think of them as our own foster kids or our own adopted kids in a way. And they were a very big part of our lives for a number of years. Each of them had come from different families in different parts of our neighborhood, and they just came to our home as another place that was safe for them. They all kind of knew each other. They all had a little bit of a unique relationship together and were like brothers and sisters, but they practically lived at our home, and we did everything with them. We took them everywhere. Maggie and I used to drive 2 cars everywhere we went because we always had 2 cars full of kids. And it was always a mixture. We rarely had all of them together, but it was always a mixture. But Sunday nights, we often would have them all together. And it was such a wonderful time for us, and and tremendous blessing, I would say, for us, because we were able to fill a void and be a part of some other children's lives that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to. And so this just adds another layer of complexity in terms of my connection to my own family, because again, I felt more connected to these children and these kids than I did to my own adopted family. but I didn't know why. So let's go back to my parents' story. So I explained to them the situation, and my dad asks to kind of start the conversation. And so he visibly is nervous. And I've never seen my dad visibly nervous. I can see the way he's playing with his hands and the way he's kind of holding himself. This is an uncomfortable thing for him. This was a very challenging position to be in, to kind of face this and address it, which I'm grateful he did. But he explained how after my brother was born, my mom was unable to have children. And the doctor told her that if she were to have another child, that it might kill her. And so I don't know all the medical background or history there, but I do know that was the reason they didn't have any more children. But they wanted more children. And so a few years later, they began to have foster children in their home. And during that time, they had some very challenging foster children. I mean, these kids came from really rough backgrounds and very challenging backgrounds. So, as you can imagine, they assumed that any child that came through this process must be challenging, or it must be a problem. But they were told they would never get a baby. They'd never get a child to have as their own. It would always be someone, an older child, maybe a teenager that they could maybe adopt. But they're never told a baby. Then one day, my dad got a phone call from my mom, and she explained that, there's a baby available. What if we got a baby? And my dad said, like, to keep, and my mom said, yeah. And he said, when? And she said, today. And so he was like, oh, and she'd already said yes, and I was on the way, I guess. And my dad shared a bit of honesty here that I was really grateful for, because my mom was trying so hard to present this attitude that she knew she loved me, and she knew who I was, and all those kinds of things. And I appreciated my dad's honesty of he wasn't sure if he could love another person's child. And then he said that once that baby was placed in his arms, he loved it. And he said that they tried to treat me the same as they did my brother and sister. And as any sibling might argue, we could say, well, I don't know if that's true. In my case, it's a little bit tricky because, again, when at a young age, when my parents were divorced, I kind of didn't have my dad around. He kind of disappeared and came around occasionally, but I didn't have the usual go to your dad's once a week and every other weekend and things like that. I just kind of went on my own and didn't really see him that often. And that bothered my mom, and it was hard for me, which kind of goes back to the reason why I probably spent a lot of time with my girlfriend's dads and trying to learn how to be a good father. But as my mom and dad continue to explain their version of this story and what they remember, my mom keeps quoting this idea that she swore on a Bible in front of the judge that they would never treat me any different than any other child. And I don't know if she thought of that as the reason why she didn't need to tell me, or if she thought of that as, well, once I've swore on the Bible, then apparently there's no reason to change the story or change any information as to how the baby came here. But that was something that she kept reiterating. Over the next few days and probably months, they took me to a doctor's where I was evaluated in every aspect possible to ensure that I wasn't a drug baby, or I came from a drug house. And I wasn't a drug baby. I didn't come from a drug user. It's not where I came from. I'm sure they could have found that out by asking the state, but that's okay. Unfortunately, a lot of what my parents shared with me, because their memory isn't super active or super accurate. Obviously, they're older, and that's a lot to remember from a long time ago. It wasn't completely accurate. In fact, I asked about records about the adoption, and my mom said, "Oh, no. I don't have any of that. I got rid of all of it." to my surprise, I thought, why? Why would you get rid of all of this? Why would you destroy any evidence of this? And she wanted nothing to do with it. She didn't want me to ever find out in any way, shape, or form that I was adopted. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, because there are certain aspects and things that I'll share with you. So in addition to things that they told me that were not necessarily accurate, or maybe they had forgotten, they told me I was adopted through LDS Family Services, and they knew both the therapists, or the employees, or social service people that dealt with it. I wasn't adopted through LDS Family Services. I contacted LDS Family Services, waited a couple of weeks, filled out some forms, waited a couple of weeks. They called me back and said, sorry, we got nothing. I even reached out to other adoption groups who, I remember one who said, give me your information, give me your date of birth. I'm absolutely sure we'll find it. And they looked it up and they said, sorry, we don't have any record of it. So nobody really had a record of how I was adopted. So that wasn't super helpful. They told me that my father was 18. He was really young. That wasn't accurate either. My father was almost 23 when I was born, so he was much older than that. And part of the reason probably that he didn't stick around, because there was some issues legally probably there. They told me the social worker that was involved in the adoption had moved back east. Nope, she lived in Moab, and she'd lived there ever since she retired. I got a chance to visit with her, had a really good conversation with her. Her version of the history of what happened was also incorrect. She told me that the adoption was closed because my father was from Salt Lake City, and there was some legal challenges there. My father wasn't from Salt Lake City. My father didn't live anywhere near Salt Lake City, but that's okay. These are some of the challenges you face as an adoptee, and you're trying to find answers, is you kind of get led down different paths based on people's memories, and then you realize that they're dead ends, and unfortunately you just have to kind of exhaust those, even if they are a little bit frustrating. They told me that my birth mom wanted to name me Joey. That wasn't true either. The note she gave me, that she gave them, as well as the blanket she gave them, was a different name, and I'll share that with you later. They told me my father was blonde. He wasn't blonde. Again, they told me that my mother and father were both very young. Again, they weren't. My mom was very young, but not my father. So there was a lot of information that was given to me that wasn't super useful. Wasn't really the right direction, but it at least got me started, and I was able to use that and make sure that I could eliminate those that information. I learned, though, that most of the town knew that I was adopted, simply because my mom was handed a child, and the last time she had a baby was 6 years before, so she had nothing. She had no baby clothes, no baby materials, and my dad's work threw him a shower, and apparently a lot of neighbors and people nearby gave my mom a baby shower, and she got lots of gifts and things like that from people, which is so kind, and I'm so grateful to those people that they were willing to help and chip in. But that is where the story kind of developed and became this story that hovered around, that everybody knew about, but I didn't. The last thing that stuck out the most during that conversation with my mom and my dad, and full disclosure, I interviewed my mom and dad and videoed it, as well as I did some audio recording. So I had a few different recordings of it, because I wanted to have some sort of history of this conversation. So I went back and watched this before I share this with you. But the thing that stuck out most to me, and that my mom had shared, was she said, I was jealous of your mom. I was jealous of her. And she said, you're my boy. And when I asked her about the documentation and the adoption papers, she said, no, I wanted those out of there. She was out of the picture, and I did not ever want her to come back. Now, for those of you who are not adopted, that may seem trivial. that may seem like, well, of course, you'd want to feel that because it's your baby and things like that. But for those of you who have children that are adopted, or those of you who have been adopted, you can appreciate how dangerous that thought process can be. Because she didn't want me to know my birth mom. She didn't want me to ever meet my birth mom. And this idea of me finding this all out was not something she wanted and something she was interested in doing. And it's something that I have to continue to process and understand, because from one vein and one perspective, it makes me very angry. It makes me very frustrated, because the fact that all that opportunity and that time was lost, that I could have known both my adopted family and my birth family. But I also recognize that this is a very hard thing for adopted parents, and I've talked to some and heard stories from others that the idea of your child seeking their birth family is scary. It's a scary proposition, and at this time of society, the early '80s, it wasn't something that I think that was talked about, or it was kind of maybe frowned upon. So, but the words of "you're my boy" is something that is hard for me to grasp or hold on to, because regardless of who is your child, even for my son Calvin, I know deep down that Calvin comes from something bigger and something greater, and that although I love him and will always love him, and will, as well as my other two boys, they are part of a bigger family, and that's not something that I would want to create a feeling of for them. So I finish with them. We go to lunch, have a nice casual lunch. As the conversation continues, I think that they felt like they'd kind of dodged a bullet. They felt like, man, he's handled this well. He's, maybe they thought, like Luke did, boy, that went well. And I think it did in a lot of ways, but in other ways, there was a lot of questions still lingering in my mind. As I drove home, I drove to work. And as I drove home, I thought about, why didn't they tell me sooner? Why didn't someone else tell me sooner? And this is something that I want to speak to, because I know that there are many people, and I am so grateful for anybody and everyone who has reached out and shared with me, hey, I've known since this point, and I've known since this point. I love that, and I'm so glad you tell that, or you share that with me, because I hold absolutely no animosity to you because you didn't tell me. It wasn't your place to tell me. But I love to hear when you found out, who else you told, and what it was like to know that and still be around me. Because I know that there are a lot of you who are listening and have listened to this that who've known for a long time, but just never shared it with me, or didn't feel like it was your place. And like I said, that's okay. But I go back to work and frantic, and I couldn't think about anything. I couldn't think about work at this point. All I could think about was, how do I find answers? What do I do? So the first thing I did is I started creating accounts. I looked at adopted.com. I looked at every single DNA site I could think of. I ordered a 23andMe kit. I went everywhere I could to find answers, and started just asking questions to people on different groups and different forums and all kinds of different things. Or I reached out to each of the people that I knew that were, or not, I didn't know, the people that I was connected to from a DNA standpoint, and started trying to ask questions. I got a hold of one of my aunts, and when I talked to her, she must have been floored. She must have just been, I don't know who you are, and I don't know how you think you know me, but I reached out to her and I said, I don't know you, you don't know me, but I took a DNA test and apparently we're related. Can you tell me a little about yourself? And she was so far from being someone that I would know, associate with, or connect with, and much older than me. And I've learned over time that she is my half aunt. So she is the half sister of my birth father, which is another whole level of complexity, but we'll go into that later. I spoke to my uncle, one of my uncles, who his name, again, not familiar, didn't have any connection. My parents thought they knew who that name was, but they don't. Um, and explained to him the situation, and he was like, I have no idea. My sister knows a little about this, but I couldn't really get much answers from that. And then there was one individual, his name was Don, and Don had, if you are in Ancestry.com, in the app, you'll learn that there are those of us who have full, complete trees, family trees that we can see, and there's hundreds and thousands of connections and all these different things because we've done a lot of genealogy work. And then there's those of us that have created an account because we did one DNA test and it's just there. And that's the only connection we have is to those people that are on there. And so I was so excited to talk to Don, and I reached out to him, but I didn't get a response. So I was so anxious to hear from him because I knew if I could get a hold of him, I bet there would be a connection there. I bet there would be something there. So I reached out to him. I started to talk to different people in different forums, and eventually I discovered on a certain group. Well, first I called Maggie, and she met me at the office, and we talked, and we talked about what had transpired. I shared with her the videos that I'd taken, and she's like, so it's real. It really is. You really are adopted, and she was just as floored as I was, and it's funny because we keep going through this where we're like, it's real. It is real, and it's like, yes, Colby. I don't know how many times you want me to say it. It's real, but you still think it's not real. You think it's a dream. You think it's just something you're thinking about, and eventually someone's going to go, no, that's not real. But it is real. And so we dive in, and I start digging into trying to find answers, and I come across a response from Facebook where someone says, oh, you need to find yourself a search angel. And I said, oh, well, what's a search angel? And they said a search angel is someone who can reach out to, or who can dig through your DNA and look at your DNA results and help you find answers. And so I decide to find a search angel. And then I meet Meredith. And I can't wait to tell you more about Meredith. That night, I go home, and Maggie has already talked to one of her friends who is very big into genealogy and family history. And she says, I'd love to help. I want to help. What can I do? And we start having a conversation and digging into the process and digging into my ancestors and start looking at everybody who's listed and anybody who's connected to me. And thus begins the journey of trying to find my birth family. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this show. I'm so grateful to have you as part of our audience. And if you have some feedback, thoughts, ideas of things that we should talk about, or questions that you want me to answer, please add them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends. Have a great day.